So this is Baruch at the Tikkun Elevator Kollel, and going back to this really beautiful edition of the likutei Maharan with so many really, really nice ideas in it. We're reading the words of the Rebbe, but also we're reading the words of the Pirush on the side to get a real idea of the flavor of what Rebbe Nachman is trying to say. So let's look at something here. He says that every time that you come to the Tzadik, you need to confess. Let me see if I can find that, get this on the page. Here it is right here. So he says this applies each time. So he says, as explained earlier, the process of eliminating one's vices and thereby attaining higher spiritual levels is ongoing. At each stage of a person's ascent on the spiritual ladder, he attains a bit more awareness of godliness. Ultimately, he can come to complete awareness. Recognition that God and His name are one, which is another way of saying that there is really no bad in anything that's happening to you. It's all coming from Him, but you may not be in harmony with Him to be able to see that. In this section, Rebbe Nachman will show you how confession in front of the Tzaddik leads to this complete awareness, the recognition that everything that happens is for the best. Now let's look down here. He has a little drush on this, and I sometimes like these a lot. Let me see if I can get it even closer. Flip it like that. Flip it like this. There we go. So he has this concept. He wants to talk about the Ein Sof, which means he translates it as the infinite one. Ein Sof literally means without end. As explained in Kabbalistic teachings, Ein Sof is the ultimate negative. It's nothing. It's a negative attribute that can be ascribed to God Himself. It not only explains or implies that God is unlike any and incomparable to any something that exists, but also that somethingness is nullified in His presence. And what's the big problem? Because we're something. And a lot of us, maybe all of us at one time or another, think that we really are something. But the fact of the matter, in the presence of the nothing of God, we're nullified. This really doesn't matter. Present God might therefore be described as the absolute, I'm going to turn this page over here, as the absolute something. It's nothing else other than Him. Nevertheless, from our vantage points, the closest we can come to conceiving of God is to know that His essence is not in any of the terms we use to describe Him. In this sense, the term Ein Sof also carries the connotation of the ultimate nothingness. In other words, there's nothing other than He, so He's the ultimate something. But that ultimate something turns out to be nothingness. Inner space, this by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's beautiful piece. Thus, in the writings of the Ari, God is described as the infinite being who is ubiquitous, omniscient, omnipotent, yet also as the absolute oneness. He is without any form. He's nothing. Now, let's go over the words again. He says that God is the infinite being. He's infinite. He's ubiquitous, means there's a lot of Him. Omniscient, present in everything, and omnipotent is He has all the energy of the universe somehow generated from Him. Yet also as the absolute oneness who is without any form. In terms of the Kabbalistic hierarchy of worlds and sefirot, Ein Sof indicates the highest level, that which is beyond any human comprehension, and aligns with the unknowable sefira, which he says called Keser. So Keser already is, my personal opinion would be, it may be aligned with the unknowable, and maybe that is the crown that is up above everything else. I would not say it was Keser, but the Pirush does say that. Let's go on. So he says this is the concept of something called Zarka. It is thrown back to the place from which it is taken. So Zarek means to throw something. This is returning Malchus to the Ein Sof. Once again, the Aliyah of Malchus to Bina, which is the world beyond, way beyond physicality, a world of real wonderfulness, which is the will in all of the wills. In other words, the ultimate will is the will of the Ein Sof, whatever that meant at the beginning. For Malchus corresponds to the letters of speech, with the will of God closed in each and every letter. It was God's will that one letter have such and such a shape, and another letter have a different shape. We find then that God's wills, the forms of the letters, serve to reveal his Malchus, and all these wills, the forms, stem from the will of the Ein Sof, which has no form at all. No, really. So let's read a little bit about the Pirush. So we had this idea of Zarka. So he says the root letters of Zarka form the Hebrew word for throw. Zarka is one of the cantillations used when reading the Torah in the synagogue. Now, I personally don't know what it is, and I know there are many people who could tell me. So it is one of the notes of the reading of the Torah. When singing, the Zarka one raises or throws his voice to a higher pitch. So he's explaining to what a Zarka is. The Zohar discusses these notes at length and explains their spiritual significance. That's in the Tikkun Zohar. Now, thrown back as it was taken. Now let's see this. The Tikkun Zohar explains repentance. What does he call doing tshuva, doing repentance, wanting to go back to our source, wanting to clean the schmutz off of our bones. He explains repentance as throwing something back to its source from which it had become separated. In our context, this relates to returning Malchus to its source by means of repentance. Now in Kabbalah, this is also called Mayim Nukvin. All the things that's wrong, all the things that's wrong with us, all the things that are wrong with our lives, we give them back to him. He brought us into the world, and he made our fortunes the way he made them. Confession in front of a Torah scholar. In addition, the Zarka is symbolic of the Tzaddik's ability to free himself from earthly desires and passions. In relation to the root of a person's soul, such desires are extremely vile and despicable. By purifying his body, the Tzaddik frees his soul to soar in the realms of holiness. His soul is, so to speak, thrown to magnificent heights where it becomes closely attached to its source. So we have this concept of Malchus to Ein Sof. All the spheros, the divine, so he says the spheros, he's calling them divine emanations. I'm not sure that I like that particular idea, but let's go with it. That's what he wrote. These divine emanations, just leave it at sphero, emanated from Ein Sof, which corresponds to Keser. Now, once again, Keser is very short of Ein Sof, but he means the ultimate high, something like that. The highest sphera, Ein Sof, is thus the source of all the 9 spheros. So within itself, that Keser has the other 9 spheros within it. So that is the other 9 spheres below it, including the final sphere, which is called Malchus. At one end of the sphere structure is Keter, also known as Ayin, nothingness. At the other end is Malchus, also known as Ani. So Ayin, which means nothingness, and Ani means I, which is a designation of self. In other words, it's distinct. Returning Malchus to Ein Sof, returning the Ani, that is the I, to Ayin, to being nothing. Returning it, I, to nothingness. Now, through all of this, I think about the shir from Rabbi Mimran, that I'm still processing all the things that he says. And we hope to get back to learning his shiurim again, where he spoke about nothingness. He's really saying that the nothingness is around us all the time, but we only are trained to, so to speak, look at something. But the something always appears in the realm and the background, no background of nothing. Think about this a little bit. Now he says the will of the Ein Sof. Everything in our world is a garment that clothes some type of will from above. Now before he was talking and he mentioned letters, that it was the will of the Ein Sof to make letters. This is a big chiddush for me. A bird is an example of one sort of will. A fire is another will, and so on. The source of all of these wills, their directions, what they want, what people want, what they're trying to do, what these animals want, what the mineral life wants. Will is the Ein Sof Keter, the will of wills. When the Tzaddik's soul ascends to the highest heights, he recognizes that Keser is the source of everything. That all at this level things no longer exist in the form of myriad separate entities, but that all is a unity, the singular will of the Holy One. Now, I do have a problem with him calling this Keser, because I know that there's actually 3 Kesarim. It's much more complicated than the way it's stated here. Not complicated, beautiful actually. Much more beautiful, much more developed. There's the Golgotha, the skull. Something was called a skull. Then there's the Avira. There's an Avir. There's an air. And then there's the Mochas Timah. It's a lower level. 3 levels of Keser. And then there's the top of the head. Of course, we talked about the Golgotha. And then there's hair, the hair of Keser, which is also known as Eric Anpen. But this Keser that he's trying to talk about is really beyond that. Beyond Eric Anpen is what's called Atik Yamim. Beyond that is the Olam of Nakudim. Beyond that. So it gets deeper and deeper and deeper into that. It's not so easy just to call it Keser in my opinion. However, at the level of Malchus, but Malchus is at the bottom, it's more differentiated. Creation is differentiated and appears as myriad separate entities. The singular will of the Ein Sof manifests as many wills. As a result of that, many distinct forms. Rebbe Nachman chooses as the paradigm of this change of God's one will becoming the shape of the letters. Now this is so interesting to me, because this is so important of how letters are made in combinations. If you go back to the concept that God is making this Ein Sof Baruch Hu, is his will is allowing the appearance of letters in certain forms. And one letter is not exactly like the next, but they have certain components in common. So he said, this ties in with what he taught earlier, that the spoken word refers to or corresponds to Malchus. So words, there are many words, and all the words have different letters in them, and all the different have different sounds behind them, and different breaths. This ties in with what he taught earlier, that the spoken word corresponds to Malchut. Here we see that the letters of speech are in fact the revelations of his Malchut. This is something that does not happen on the unknowable and ineffable level of the Ein Sof Keser. In other words, that is which is beyond comprehension. There's a concept over here that we call the Reish, the Lo Isya, the Rabla, which is the unknowable head, because it has no physicality that we could understand. Because we can only understand things as the Re tells us that from my body I'll be able to understand God. That's true. You could do that to a certain extent. But beyond, there is a level beyond that doesn't correspond very well. So he said this is something that does not happen on the unknowable and ineffable level of the Ein Sof Keser. Only in Malchus. So Malchus already we see is a concept of differentiation, and he's stating that Malchus is the place in which the letters actually form, that you actually see the pieces, where his will is contracted in more finite aspects. So this does the revelation of his will manifest, so that is that the revelation of his will there is manifest in all the forms and functions of which creation is comprised. This is Baruch Fleischman, Tikkun Elevator Kola. We're going really through Likutei Maharan, the fourth Torah here, and beautiful little piece.